Hello, this is Dr. Llewellyn, and welcome to our second lecture of this class, and the first in our section on religion in late antiquity. Before launching into a brief history of Judaism and Greek and Roman religion, we're going to talk a little bit about the social values of the Roman Empire, the empire within which Christianity will emerge. This is necessary because this empire, which imposed itself on a huge portion of what we call the Western world, was successful in part due to what may surprise some of you. In addition to its ability to keep the majority of its people oppressed, Rome was also successful as an empire because of the piety that it imposed upon its subjects, those who were subject to the violence of Rome. So Rome as an empire has two important origin stories that are going to influence the values that Rome will hold dear. The first origin story is chronological. Rome doesn't start out as an empire. It starts out actually as a little hut village on a river, and very quickly develops from a hut village of a series of hills into a city by 753 BCE. Within about 250 years, it has become a city-state, and it has grown in its importance from simply a city to a city-state, occupying a great deal of the territory of what we today call Italy. And within a very short period after that, it becomes a kingdom encompassing most of the Italian territory. By 27 BCE, it is an empire. So rule, which is centered in Rome, now extends beyond the borders of Italia and encompasses a mass portion of the Mediterranean, all the way into Armenia here, up to Britannia here, and across the peninsula, North Africa, down into Egypt, all of the Palestinian area here, Syria, modern-day Turkey, then known as Anatolia, and the Eastern European territory of Macedonia and Greece. Okay, so that's a pretty broad territory, and the social values that Rome held dear would often clash in contrast with the social values of those who were not of Latin descent. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. A second origin story that Rome and the Roman Empire would hold dear is that which we would call legendary. So in contrast to the chronological origin story of Rome, the legendary origin story of Rome is more colorful and fantastical, of course, as most origin stories are. On this frieze here, we have some of the central characters of the origin story of Rome. This figure here is the god Mars, and this figure here is Rhea Silvia. Rhea Silvia was a Vestal virgin, and Vestals were drawn from among the upper ordered families of Roman society. These were women who tended the hearth of the Temple of Vestia, where all Roman families would go to get fire to heat their homes. So you can understand the importance of this particular temple and the job of these women. Vestal virgins were women who were married to their job, really, and this was great if that's what you wanted. If you were of a lower ordered family and you wanted to be a Vestal, you didn't get that option. If you were if you were a daughter of a higher ordered family and you didn't want to be a Vestal, you didn't have that option. So the only people for whom this worked were women for whom being a Vestal was their desire. Anyway, in this particular origin story, the god Mars sees this Vestal virgin and he embraces her, and she becomes pregnant. and she gives birth to twins. So for those of you who have some background in the study of religion, the idea of a divine parent and a mortal parent should be something that seems very familiar to you, especially in this case, because it's a divine male figure and a virginal female figure. That should be like, oh, okay, I see where this is going. So Rhea Silvia gives birth to twins, pictured here. And giving birth to twins was problematic in the Roman Empire. It was seen as monstrous. Even though they didn't have the same understanding of biology, the idea of giving birth to two infants was seen as particularly problematic. Twins were, again, to use the word, they were considered monstrous. They were an aberration from the norm. Additionally, Rhea's father was concerned because he felt these twin boys would challenge his kingship, and he didn't want that. So, as is often the case in these stories, the children were sent away to be exposed, which means put out and let the elements kill them. And this was the legal right, and I would also add the legal expectation of someone, specifically a male member of the family, that if the child differed from the norm or was unwanted or was female, they could be sold or they were expected to kill them. They were expected to them. That was a legal mandate. Anyway, the children were exposed and they were found by the river god who spared them and set them to be nourished by a female wolf here. They were found by a shepherd, pictured here, who took pity on the boys and brought them home and gave them to his wife to raise them as his sons. So the image of two youths nursing at a wolf is a symbolic image of Rome. It's a central image in Roman identity and central to this legendary origin story. According to the accounts, the two boys grew up. Their names were Romulus and Remus, and in time, they were, as is often the case in stories about brothers, they were set against each other and became enemies. They built a city and fell out over the naming of the city, and you can probably guess which of the two brothers was the winner in that. It was, of course, Romulus, and the city was named Rome after Romulus. In time, Remus died, was killed. There were a couple of different accounts of the story, and so his death varies depending on who's telling the tale. So you can see that there are legendary and chronological versions of the development of this important city that in time is an empire that encompasses a broad territory. And so both of these accounts, that you have a village that becomes a city, that becomes a city-state, that becomes an empire, that has those who rule over it, will be one side of the coin, but on the other side of the coin is always this understanding that this figure of Roma, this divine spirit of the city, that it is a city that emerges from a miraculous birth, rooted in divine parentage and the activity of a Vestal Virgin. This will always be part of the identity of the Roman Empire, which is an empire that's going to welcome and easily incorporate religious views of its conquered people into it. And this is, of course, part of Roman culture. And culture is really how people and groups create order, right? I mean, we do this by defining what is proper and what is improper for society. We determine what is proper behavior, what is proper language, and what's proper and improper is defined as values. And these values provide a framework for meaningful communication and for relationships that make sense. When people engage in behavior that defies those boundaries that culture provides, then it's confusing. It's confusing for people. So let's talk a little bit about the social values in the Roman world, the values that shaped Roman culture. Okay, and this connects with the De Silva reading that I asked you to do. And so I'm just going to highlight briefly the 4 values that are going to be really important for reading our texts. Okay, so one important value is that of honor and shame. And honor and shame is a system of peer evaluation. And in the Roman world, a person was led from the time of childhood to adulthood to seek honor and to avoid disgrace. It's really important to remember that honor is affirmation of one's worth by your peers. You don't feel honorable. You are honorable, or you behave in a way that is honorable. It's a value that is imposed upon you. Okay, and likewise shame, which is different from embarrassment. Embarrassment is something that you feel, but shame is something that's put on you by other people. And so honor and shame are qualities that are based on one's ability to embody the virtues that society values. Okay. The problem, of course, is that Rome as an empire is multicultural. And so honor varies. An honorable Jew in Roman eyes might be a shameful Jew in Jewish eyes. So these will be the kinds of conflicts that will emerge. So honor and shame are things that the system of peer evaluation is specific to this time period. So courage is something that is honorable. So the willingness to fight, right, on behalf of your country, that's seen as honorable. But cowardice, right, so running away from war or shirking your duty to fight for your country, that is considered shameful. Okay, so power, or having the ability to win, or the ability to pay for something to be won, that's considered honorable. Losing a battle is shameful. Being generous to the right people, okay, is honorable. Being generous to the wrong people is shameful. Okay, being stingy to the wrong people, right, is also problematic as well, right? So lending money was seen as honorable as long as you were lending to the right people, so your peers. If you are lending to people who are not your peers, that's shameful. Coming from a stable family was considered honorable. Undermining your family or coming from a low status family, that's considered shameful. Okay? So purity and pollution is another social value that's important for this time period. Purity and pollution is a system of the regulation of space. Okay, so if honor and shame is a system of peer evaluation, purity and pollution is a system of the regulation of space. You have to be clean, right? You have to be pure in order to be able to enter into certain spaces. And so purity codes in the Roman Empire and in religion in general, it sort of draws lines around sacred time, sacred food, sacred animals, sacred clothing, sacred people, and so on and so forth. Purity and pollution codes really allow groups to maintain sort of national and familial identity, and they certainly regulate who belongs where, or who is let in and who is let out. Okay, purity and pollution can be about not only just ritual space, but also public space. Okay, patron and client is its own kind of system, and it's a system of obligation around issues of, say, grace and gratitude. Okay, so money in the Roman Empire was, and property was pretty much focused in the hands of just a few people. And most people had to seek a patron. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you an economic chart of the Roman world so you can see what this looks like. The job of the patron was to give, okay? And that meant money or grain or employment or land or social advancement. And the job of the client was to accept whatever they were given and then to publicize the fact that they'd been given something, to praise the patron for giving something, to contribute to the patron's reputation and esteem, and also to perform favors for the patron. So patron and client is a very, very old system. So whenever you encounter someone who expects you to praise them, or someone who expects you to publicize what they've done for you, or to say nice things about them, you're dealing with this sort of antiquated way of thinking about grace and favor, okay? And then finally, you have this last system, which is that of kinship, and that's really a system of trust. So we have these different systems here. Honor and shame is peer evaluation. Purity and pollution is the regulation of space. Patron and client is a system of obligation around grace and gratitude, or grace and favor. And finally, kinship is about systems of trust. All right? So your family of origin was that which situated your place in the world. Okay? And it shaped your self-perception and your perception of others. Without a solid pedigree, without a system of trust, your place and your privileges in the world were in jeopardy. Family reputation was the starting point for everything. It could be very difficult to overcome, coming from a family where the father has a low reputation, or coming from an environment in which you were illegitimate. It's also could be difficult to overcome engaging in bad behavior, which would shame your family, or if someone in your family engaged in bad behavior and shamed your family. And of course, it could be difficult to overcome gender. My cat is now crawling on my desk, so there might be some rustling of papers here. So, being male in this world automatically was a better starting point than being a woman, which we'll talk about extensively in this class, actually. And then, of course, kinship was used to promote the advancement of the family. One way that women did have an advantage was that in this world they could marry up, whereas generally men could not, right? Okay, so these are our social values. We're going to come back to them time and time again. You're going to see every single one of these weaving their way through early Christian texts for several centuries. All of these are still present in our world today, right? And it's very easy. Careful, sweetheart. It's very easy to identify when they're operational, especially like right now, right? During a time of global pandemic. Issues around purity and pollution are really significant. So another Roman virtue that I just want to touch bases on is fides, because it's probably the most misunderstood, and I'm going to hear it constantly. You will all hear it constantly, and you'll want to use it. Fides is a word that means trust, okay? It is connected to the word pistis, and it's roughly translated in our culture as belief. So you will hear people use the word, or you'll see translated, so-and-so believed, or so-and-so had faith. We need to understand the root of this particular word, okay? It is a word that in Latin and in Greek is affiliated with hope, it's affiliated with good character, and it's affiliated with reliability, okay? So what I mean by that is that someone who demonstrates fides, or faith, is demonstrating not necessarily belief, but they're demonstrating hope, or they're demonstrating good character, all right? So we're going to come back to this again and again and again. But I need you to start sort of putting this word and this understanding of the word into your vocabulary, into your brain. All right? Because a lot of times people will use that as an excuse to not explore a text further. Oh, so-and-so, this happened because someone had faith. Well, what does that mean? Right? We use the word faith in our world to when we don't want to go any further in a conversation. when we wanted to say, oh, well, it was magical thinking. Okay? That's not what the word fides or faith meant. Okay? In the first century. And so we need to be mindful of that value. Okay? So I promised you an economic chart, and this will be the last piece we address before I remind you of your reading and homework assignment, because the economic structure of the Roman Empire really was significant for how religion operated in the first century. So largely the population was divided up into 3 different economic sections. There were no classes, all right? There were orders. And the upper order, the highest level of status, was the wealthy, okay? And the wealthy was about 4 to 6% of the population. And their job was to provide benefits to keep the middlings, which is most of the population, happy, okay? So let's be very clear about what this means. The highest, okay, those with the most money, the wealthiest people, were obligated to provide public benefits for the betterment of the lives of those who had nothing, okay? And it wasn't out of the kindness of their heart, it was out of the largeness of their pockets, okay? This was a way of keeping the majority of the people, it was a way of providing them with basic needs, but also a way of keeping them quiet, all right? So they were provided with things like public utilities, for sewers, for bathing, which, helps with health. What you're looking at here is a coliseum, so for games, to keep people entertained. And it seems like this is a good thing, and it is, because these were the wealthiest people, so they were obligated to assist those who didn't have anything. But it was a way to demonstrate their honor, okay? And it was a way to keep people quiet. So we have to recognize both sides of, the reason behind these benefits. The majority of the population was middling, and this is not middle class, okay? This is not at all middle class. The middlings were people who were, if you were, say, someone who engaged in fishing for a living, or if you were a craftsperson, so you maybe were a carpenter or a blacksmith or a tanner, or you were a farmer, okay? These were people who lived hand to mouth. They were not middle class. Middle class, as we understand it, is people who are largely employed. They have a house that they own. They pay a mortgage on. They have a car or reliable transportation. They have employment, and they have some savings. That's middle class. That's not what 90% of the population was, okay? About 90% of the population were people who were living on the absolute verge of destitution, and they were living on the verge of falling into indigency, okay? The indigent were those who had nothing. They were the absolutely most despised people. They were homeless, they were ill, they were impoverished, they were dying, they were hungry, okay? So really, the task of the middlings were those, the main job of being middling was to not become indigent. Okay? And then, of course, alongside all of this was an enslaved population. 1 in 4 people in the Roman Empire, 25% of the population in the Roman Empire was enslaved. Okay? And you had enslaved portions of the population represented by all aspects of society. There were some, if you were a part of the slave household of the upper order, the most wealthy, you could rise to a considerable position of prominence and be a slave manager, have your own slaves. It was an economic, not a racial distinction, okay? Which doesn't make it any better, right? Ownership of a person is horrific and unjust, full stop. But it's important to recognize that the slave component of society was one into which one could move in or move out, okay? You weren't a slave by virtue of the color of your skin. You were an enslaved person because either you were a conquered person, okay, or you were sold into that system by your family, or you sold yourself into that system, Okay, so it's important to remember that a quarter of the population was enslaved, which of course impacts everything. It impacts economics, it impacts production, it impacts healthcare, it impacts religious activity, and we'll come back to this. It's also important to keep in mind the Mediterranean diet, which, as we know, is like the healthiest in the world. Okay, grains and fruits and vegetables and meats and fish and oils and breads and cheeses and all kinds of good dairy. But this isn't what everybody's eating. Okay, so 4% of the population gets this. All right, 90% of the population gets this, and maybe some oil to go with it. And then, of course, the indigent, right, here's their diet. Okay, so we have to keep in mind that the Roman Empire as an empire is incredibly effective. All right, it's effective in its rule, in its laws, in its military, in its syncretistic religious practices. I'll explain that further in 2 lessons. Okay, but it's effective because it keeps the majority of its population oppressed. All right, so we have to keep that in mind. All right, so at this point, if you haven't read it already, please read the De Silva. Please do the homework connected to it and upload it on the assignment page. And then, if you have questions about this, lecture, about the reading, please write them down, and we will discuss them in our Friday tutorial. I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.